January 17th, 1945. The hills of Luzon shuddered beneath a low gray sky. Dawn had not yet broken, but the jungle was already alive. Cicadas droning in mechanical chorus, the humid air thick enough to choke. Somewhere along the ridgeline northeast of Clark Field, a Japanese officer named Captain Iwao Nakamura stood at the edge of a bamboo thicket, staring through his field glasses at the American positions below. His hands were steady, but his stomach had been empty for 3 days. Behind him, 14,000 men of the Imperial Japanese Army's Kembu Group crouched in ravines, clutching their rifles, their eyes hollow and feverish. They had been told this was the hour to reclaim what had been lost, the hour to prove that the spirit of Yamato still burned, even as the empire crumbled. Nakamura lowered his glasses. Yet the order had come down from General Rikichi Tsukada himself. Launch a night assault, break the American perimeter, retake Clark Field. It was not a suggestion. It was a command forged in desperation. The men behind him had marched through the jungle for weeks, subsisting on handfuls of rice and the flesh of pack horses. Many had dysentery, some had malaria, but they had been told that the Americans were soft, that their supply lines were thin, that one bold strike could turn the tide. Nakamura did not believe this, but he did not voice his doubt. He was a soldier. He would lead his men forward into the teeth of whatever awaited them on that ridge. At 0400 hours, the first shells began to fall. Not from Japanese guns, from American ones. The night erupted in flame. The ridge became a wall of fire. And to understand what happened in those 25 minutes, one must first understand how the Japanese army arrived at this moment. A moment so catastrophic that even decades later, veterans would struggle to speak of it. By January 1945, the Philippines had become a graveyard for the Japanese Empire. General Douglas MacArthur had returned as he had promised, and his forces were grinding northward through Luzon with the relentless efficiency of a steel press. The Kembu Group, a composite force scraped together from remnants of the 2nd Tank Division, the 10th Division, and various fortress units, had been tasked with defending the vital airfields and mountain passes west of Manila. They were undermanned, undersupplied, and under no illusions about their odds. Yet they were bound by a code older than the war itself. Bushido is the way of the warrior, which demanded that a soldier fight to the last breath, that surrender was dishonor, that death in battle was the highest service. General Tsukada had set up his headquarters in the hills near Bamban. He was a veteran of campaigns in China and Malaya, a man who had once believed in the invincibility of Japanese arms. But here, in the jungles of Luzon, he watched his divisions dissolve like salt in water. American artillery was everywhere. American aircraft owned the sky. American tanks moved with a speed and firepower that seemed almost otherworldly to men who had trained with wooden rifles and outdated doctrine. Still, Tsukada clung to one hope: the possibility of a shock attack, a sudden, overwhelming thrust that would shatter the enemy's morale and buy time for the defense of Manila. It was a gambler's hope, and the kind born of exhaustion and the refusal to accept the inevitable. On the night of January 16th, Tsukada issued his orders. The Kembu Group would concentrate its remaining strength, 14,000 men, the last reserves, and launch a pre-dawn assault on the American positions anchored along a ridgeline near the village of Stone Thomas. The plan was simple in conception, impossible in execution. The men would move under cover of darkness, infiltrate the American lines, and charge at dawn. They would use their numbers, their willingness to die, as a weapon. They expected chaos. They expected close combat. They expected, perhaps, a miracle. What they did not expect was what the Americans had been preparing for 3 days. The men who waited on that ridge were not the soft, pleasure-seeking soldiers of Japanese propaganda. They were veterans of the 6th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division. Units that had fought their way across the Pacific in campaigns where death came not in honorable charges, but in the slow, grinding attrition of jungle warfare. They had learned to dig deep, to set fields of fire, to turn every hilltop into a fortress. And they had something else, an abundance of material that seemed, to their Japanese counterparts, almost fantastical. By mid-January, the American logistics network on Luzon had achieved a kind of terrible perfection. Ammunition arrived by the truckload. Artillery shells were stacked in pyramids 20 feet high. Each rifleman carried more bullets than a Japanese soldier might see in a month. There were reserves behind reserves, supply dumps behind supply dumps, and overhead. It's the constant drone of reconnaissance planes ensuring that nothing moved in the jungle without being seen. Lieutenant Colonel Harold K. Johnson, commanding a battalion of the 1st Cavalry, had spent the previous 72 hours fortifying his section of the line. He had placed .50 caliber machine guns at overlapping intervals. He had zeroed in mortar crews on likely approach routes. He had set up trip flares and barbed wire, and he had made sure every man knew the plan. Let them come close, then open fire. There would be no retreat. There would be no panic. There would only be the methodical application of firepower until nothing moved in front of them. On the evening of January 16th, American scouts reported movement in the jungle. Lots of it. Radio intercepts suggested a major attack was imminent. Johnson passed the word down the line. Stand ready. The men checked their weapons, filled their canteens, and smoked their last cigarettes. Some wrote letters they would never send. Most simply waited, staring into the darkness, listening to the jungle breathe. At 03:45 hours, the first Japanese scouts emerged from the tree line. They moved in silence, shadows among shadows, probing for weak points. American sentries spotted them. The word went out. Then, at precisely 0400 hours, the American artillery opened up. 105mm howitzers, 155mm long toms, mortars of every caliber. They all spoke at once, and the jungle became an inferno. The Japanese had expected to achieve surprise. Instead, they were the ones surprised, caught in the open, their formations shredded before the assault had truly begun. But the attack did not stop. Orders were orders. Honor demanded it. Out of the smoke and flame, the first wave of Japanese soldiers charged. They came in ragged lines, bayonets fixed, screaming the banzai that had once terrified enemy armies from Manchuria to Singapore. They came with rifles, with grenades, with swords drawn. They came because they had been told to come, and because to turn back was unthinkable. The ridge erupted. Machine guns chattered in long, unbroken bursts. Rifles cracked in disciplined volleys. Mortars walked their fire back and forth across the slope. Within minutes, the first wave was annihilated. Bodies lay heaped in the tall grass, some still moving, most not. The second wave came anyway, then the third. For 25 minutes, the Japanese kept coming, kept dying, yet kept pushing forward into a storm of steel that turned men into meat and meat into mud. Captain Nakamura led his company up the slope. He saw his lieutenant cut down by machine gun fire 10 feet ahead of him. He saw a young private, barely 18, take a bullet through the neck and collapse without a sound. He saw the ridge above him wreathed in muzzle flashes, a constellation of death. And still he climbed, because to stop was to abandon everything he had been taught to believe. He made it within 50 yards of the American line before a burst of .30 caliber fire stitched across his chest. He fell backward, tasted blood, and thought of his wife in Osaka. He did not think of glory. He thought of rice, of warm sake, of his daughter's laugh. Then he thought nothing at all. By 04:25 hours, the attack was over. Not because the Japanese had broken through, not because the Americans had faltered, but because there was no one left to attack. The slope was carpeted with bodies. The jungle smelled of cordite and torn earth and the copper stink of blood. American medics moved forward cautiously, searching for wounded. They found few. The Japanese did not surrender. They died where they fell, clutching their rifles, their faces frozen in expressions of determination or terror, or a strange, serene acceptance. In the days that followed, American intelligence officers pieced together what had happened. Captured documents revealed the scale of the disaster. 14,000 men had been committed to the attack. Fewer than 3,000 survived. Most of those survivors were scattered through the jungle, leaderless, starving, pursued by American patrols. General Tsukada's headquarters was overrun within a week. The Kembu group ceased to exist as a cohesive force. The defense of Luzon collapsed in stages, each stage bloodier and more futile than the last. What the Japanese soldiers had expected was a chance to fight on equal terms, to prove that courage and spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They had been raised in a culture that venerated sacrifice, that taught them death in battle was a form of transcendence. They had heard the stories of Port Arthur, of the victories in Manchuria, of the early days of the Pacific War when Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. They believed, or had been made to believe, that the Americans were decadent, weak, more concerned with comfort than victory. They believed that one fierce assault, one moment of pure will, it could change the course of the war. What they encountered instead was a doctrine built not on bravery, but on efficiency. The Americans did not fight for honor, they fought to win, and they were willing to use every advantage their industrial might could provide. The ridge was not defended by supermen, it was defended by ordinary soldiers who had been given the tools to turn any battlefield into a killing ground. Every American rifleman carried an M1 Garand, a semi-automatic weapon that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger. Every squad had a Browning automatic rifle, capable of sustained fire that could cut down a dozen men in seconds. Every battalion had access to artillery that could drop shells with terrifying precision, and behind them, an entire logistical empire that ensured the shells kept coming. Yes, the contrast was not just tactical, it was philosophical. The Japanese army was built on the idea that men could overcome steel, that morale could triumph over machines. The American army was built on the opposite premise, that steel, properly applied, made individual heroism unnecessary. It was not that American soldiers lacked courage. Many were brave, but they did not have to be suicidal to be effective. They could dig in, call for fire support, and let the shells do the dying for them. One American soldier, a private named George Hennigan from Ohio, wrote in his diary that night, "They kept coming. I couldn't believe it. We were cutting them down and they kept coming. I don't know if that's bravery or madness or something else, but it sure as hell wasn't going to work. Not here, and not against what we had waiting." Among the ruins of the Kembu group, American patrols found something that became a kind of grim legend, a single leather satchel carried by a Japanese medical officer containing not medicine but carefully preserved letters from soldiers to their families. They were never sent. The officer had been killed in the assault. The letters were forwarded eventually through Red Cross channels years after the war ended. One of them, written by a corporal named Hiroshi Tanaka, read, "Mother, by the time you read this, I will have done my duty. I am not afraid. I only regret that I will not see the cherry blossoms again. Tell my sister I thought of her always. Tell Father I died as he taught me, facing the enemy, without shame." The letter was dated January 15th, 1945, written with a careful hand. Yes, the characters precise and beautiful. It was found in the mud, soaked through, barely legible, but it survived. That letter became, for many, a symbol of the human cost hidden beneath the cold statistics. 14,000 men, 3,000 survivors, thousands of families who would receive only a brief notice, a posthumous promotion, and a wooden box supposedly containing ashes that might or might not belong to their son, their brother, their husband. The Japanese government would later record the assault as a strategic regrouping and downplay the losses. But the soldiers who lived through it, on both sides, knew the truth. It had been a slaughter, a futile sacrifice on an altar built of outdated doctrine and desperate command. The Americans did not celebrate. There was no jubilation. They buried their dead, 38 men killed, as mostly by Japanese mortar fire before the assault, and moved on. There was still Manila to take, still Corregidor to reclaim, still months of fighting ahead. But they understood, in a way that could not be spoken, that something had shifted. The Japanese were still dangerous, still willing to die, but they were no longer capable of winning. The war had become a grinding down, a process of attrition in which the outcome was already determined. Among the captured equipment found in the aftermath was a single canteen, Japanese issue, dented and worn, with a small pouch attached. Inside the pouch were 3 grains of rice and a folded paper crane. The canteen belonged to a sergeant whose name was never determined. He had carried it through campaigns in China, through the jungles of Burma, and finally to this ridge in Luzon. Yet the rice was meant to be his last meal before the assault. He never ate it. The crane, folded from a scrap of newspaper, was a charm for safe return. It did not work. An American lieutenant kept the canteen as a souvenir, then later donated it to a museum, where it sits today behind glass, a relic of a war that consumed millions and left only fragments behind. That canteen became, in its way, a symbol of the gulf between the two armies. For the Japanese soldier, war was a spiritual trial, a test of character in which material things mattered less than the purity of intent. He carried 3 grains of rice not because he was starving, though he often was, but because restraint was a virtue, because to ask for more was to admit weakness. He carried a paper crane because belief, however fragile, was better than despair. And for the American soldier, war was a job, a grim and necessary task to be completed with the tools at hand. He carried a full canteen, sea rations, ammunition pouches heavy with clips, a poncho, a first aid kit, cigarettes, candy bars. He was not expected to endure hunger or thirst or deprivation. He was expected to fight effectively, and to do that, he needed to be fed, supplied, and supported. This was the true asymmetry of the Pacific War. Not just firepower, though firepower mattered, not just numbers, though numbers helped, but a fundamental difference in how each side conceived of the soldier's role. The Japanese soldier was an instrument of the emperor's will, expected to transcend his physical needs through discipline and spirit. The American soldier was a cog in a vast machine. He is expected to perform his function as long as the machine kept running. When the machine ran smoothly, when the trucks delivered the ammunition, when the artillery answered the call, when the bombers returned on schedule, it was almost impossible to stop. The transformation that took place in the minds of those who survived the assault was profound. For the Americans, it confirmed what they had been learning across every island, every campaign, that the war would not end in a single glorious battle, but in the slow, methodical destruction of an enemy who refused to quit. For the Japanese, it shattered the last illusions. Officers who had believed in the possibility of a negotiated peace, who had clung to the idea that one more victory might bring the Americans to the table, now understood that no such victory was possible. The men who staggered back from the ridge carried with them not just wounds, but the knowledge that their sacrifices, however courageous, were meaningless in the face of such overwhelming force. One survivor, a lieutenant named Kenji Matsumoto, was captured 3 weeks later, half dead from starvation and infected wounds. During his interrogation, he was asked why he had not surrendered earlier. He replied, through a translator, "Because to surrender is to cease to be Japanese. But after the ridge, I began to wonder if being Japanese was worth dying for. I have no answer. I am still here, so perhaps I have already chosen. He was sent to a POW camp in Guam, where he survived the war and eventually returned to Japan. He never spoke of the assault again, not to his family, not to historians. And he opened a small bookstore in Kyoto and lived to be 73, a quiet man with sad eyes who flinched at loud noises. The records show that the assault on the ridge near Stone Thomas was not an isolated incident. Across the Pacific, the pattern repeated: desperate Japanese attacks, overwhelming American firepower, casualties that defied comprehension. At Iwo Jima, 21,000 Japanese soldiers defended an island 8 square miles in size, and only 216 were captured alive. At Okinawa, the Japanese lost over 100,000 soldiers, and still the fighting continued until there was nothing left but rubble and ghosts. Each battle taught the same lesson, but the lesson could not be learned because the system that produced these battles was incapable of adaptation. The doctrine was fixed. The honor code was fixed. Yet the only variable was the scale of the dying. American commanders, studying the aftermath, began to understand the grim calculus of the war's endgame. If Japan would not surrender, if every island, every hill, every city had to be taken at such cost, then the invasion of the Japanese home islands would be a bloodbath beyond imagining. Estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties, with Japanese losses in the tens of millions. It was this understanding, born in places like the ridge at Stone Thomas, that would later inform the decision to use the atomic bomb. The ridge did not make that decision inevitable, but it made it thinkable. It showed, in the starkest terms, that the Japanese military would fight to the last man, and that the last man would die for nothing. Today, the ridge is quiet. The jungle has reclaimed it. Trees grow where men fell. Farmers till the soil, and sometimes they find rusted helmets, spent shell casings, the corroded remains of a bayonet or a canteen. There is a small monument erected by local villagers with plaques in both English and Japanese. It lists no names, there are too many, but it bears a simple inscription: "Here men died for causes they did not choose. May we remember them and seek to ensure that such causes do not arise again." Pilgrims come occasionally, old men, American and Japanese, who walk the ridge slowly, leaning on canes, their eyes distant. They do not speak to each other, though they fought on opposite sides. There is nothing to say. They share only the knowledge that they survived something that should not have happened. That the ridge was a monument not to valor, but to the machinery of war, to the way in which young men are fed into the gears of history and ground into dust. In the broader sweep of the war, the assault on the ridge was a footnote. It did not change the strategic picture. It did not delay the American advance by more than a day. But for those who were there, it was everything. It was the moment when the illusion of honorable combat finally shattered, when the gap between belief and reality became too wide to bridge. The Japanese had charged believing they could still win. The Americans had waited, knowing they already had. And in 25 minutes, that certainty was written in blood and fire across a hillside that no one remembers. The war would continue for 7 more months. Manila would burn. Okinawa would drown in blood. As 2 cities would vanish in atomic fire, but the pattern had been set. The outcome had been determined, not by courage or cowardice, but by a simple, terrible equation. One side had the will to die, and the other had the means to kill. In the end, the means won. It always does. And so the ridge stands, silent and green, a scar on the earth where 14,000 men learned, in the space of 25 minutes, that belief is not enough, that spirit cannot stop bullets, that the old codes do not matter when the new world brings such firepower to bear. They died bravely, these men, but bravery could not save them. They died honorably, if honor can exist in such slaughter, but honor could not change the outcome. They died, and the ridge swallowed them, and the war moved on. In the museum in Manila, as the canteen with the paper crane sits behind glass, visitors pause, read the placard, and move on. But sometimes a veteran will stop and stare, and if you watch closely, you can see his hand tremble, just slightly, as he remembers not the glory of victory or the nobility of sacrifice, but the simple, awful truth that war reveals, that in the end, we are all just flesh and bone, and the machines we build are better at breaking us than we ever are at stopping them. The ridge remembers. It does not judge. It simply stands, a testament to the day when 14,000 men charged into the future, and the future cut them down.